Hello, and welcome to week 7 of Mondays with Miss E. We are halfway through this YouTube read aloud adventure. All right, my book-related T-shirt for today. I've got my creative writer shirt on. This was actually a shirt that came from a colleague in my office. And she offered these shirts to everyone, and we got to pick which kind of writer we wanted to be. And I forget what the other choices were, but I chose creative. And there's a couple of hashtags: FCPS rights and own literacy. And I'm going to throw the link to the FCPS literacy Twitter account in the into this video, so you can check them out on Twitter. But that's where my book related T-shirt came from today, my creative writer T-shirt. So we have 2 chapters from Missy today. Both of these chapters, when I was looking back over them, I realized that they were both chapters that I struggled a little bit with as I was planning them out and getting ready to write them. And the first one, if you remember last week, we ended with Miss E kind of telling Bets that she was going to change her perspective. She wanted Bets' story, and she felt like she didn't really get an honest answer from her. And she said, well, I'm going to, let's get together this weekend and I'm going to change your perspective. And there was sort of that double meeting. She changed her perspective by taking her up in her airplane, or an airplane. And now we're going to kind of see the second half of that, which is her kind of Miss E trying to give Bets a different outlook on her mom and how she feels about her mom. So I knew kind of going into this that this was an important piece of the story. Bets's current relationship with her mom, and the how that evolves through Bets's friendship with Miss E, and what she learns from Miss E, how her relationship with her mom evolves. I knew that I wanted to make that a part of the story. And I had in mind for a long time in planning this conversation between Bets and Miss E. What I was struggling with is that I felt like the chapter was going to be very heavy on dialogue. And we had just come from an earlier chapter where Miss E spends a lot of time talking. I didn't really want to have another chapter that was full of talking, and very likely full of Bets talking. So I ended up with this really kind of very stream of consciousness speech by Bets that sort of comes off as a little bit angry, and she's just venting and getting it all out, which I thought was kind of appropriate for the situation. And then I decided to give Miss E this kind of this aspect of her where she doesn't really, where she says very little. And I thought about people that I encountered, or famous people that I know of that seem very wise, very intelligent, but at the same time don't really do a whole lot of talking. And their wisdom seems to come from what they don't say, and contrasting that to an adult talking to a teenager and trying to give advice, and the teenager just kind of tuning that out and rolling her eyes. So I didn't think that it made sense for Miss E to have kind of that preachy adult approach to helping Bets. And it seemed to be a much better fit for her character to kind of give her this very silent but wise aspect. So that was sort of my solution to, well, how do I make this conversation happen, and how do I bring this plot point into the story without giving the reader another chapter that's full of a lot of dialogue. So here we go. Let's jump into our first chapter for this week. And this chapter title is Perspective. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong chapter. That was last week's chapter. I gave the right intro, but I didn't have the book open to the right page. All right, last week's chapter was called Perspective. This week's chapter is Lessons. And you'll remember from last week that Miss E and Bets have just kind of almost crash landed in this cornfield, but Miss E has brought them in for a pretty decent landing, even though the plane, even though the engine is no longer running. All right, lessons. The air above the cornfield was still and hot. Dust hung as if captured in a photograph. Only the buzzing bees seemed capable of moving in the suspended air. The rows of corn stretched out around us in all directions, but we pushed through it until we reached the road. The tail of the duster still stuck out beyond the last rows of corn, and Miss E sat down at the edge of the road in its shadow and gestured for me to join her. Like crash landing a crop duster in a cornfield and then sitting down to a relaxing lunch was the most natural thing in the world. From the patch of shade, our flight seemed a distant memory. The duster sat as if it had always been in the field, and Miss E spread a picnic blanket out on the dirt road. Even though it wasn't the place she said she had in mind, it felt like the exact right place, and it didn't seem possible that we'd reached the spot in a powerless plane that was very quickly falling out of the air. But I still felt like Miss E had some explaining to do. "What happened up there?" She smiled pleasantly and responded in a voice that sounded like we'd done nothing all morning but lounge in a cornfield. "Up where? Oh, the plane, do you mean?" "Of course I mean the plane. What happened? The engine stopped." "Exactly, Bets. It would seem you've asked and answered your question in the same breath. Well done. Although I suppose you could have saved yourself the talking and me the listening. Have a deviled egg, Bets." She smiled again and winked before putting half a deviled egg in her mouth and then rolling her eyes in pleasure. She was different. I'd seen Miss E in a way that none of the other people in town had. When she went to town, she was playing the part of the grouchy old lady who never talked to anyone and only grumbled under her breath. She let the guys fade away from me, but when I saw her in the cornfield, I realized the Miss E I'd gotten to know while sitting at her kitchen table wasn't entirely the real Miss E either. Not really, at least not the way she used to be. The kitchen table Miss E was resigned to living out her life stuck on a farm with a plane hidden away in a barn, resigned to living with 30-year-old choices gone sour, resigned to not really living at all. But the Missy I met in the cornfield was full of life. She smiled, she giggled, and she seemed to want nothing more than to be exactly where she was at that moment, doing exactly what she was doing. I realized that this was how Miss E used to be, back when she was flying, back when she could be Amelia Earhart for real. "Pickle?" She bit in with a crunch and another eye roll. "But the engine stopped. Why did the engine stop?" "Oh, Bets, get over it. Back when I started flying, if you had a flight without the engine dying or the flaps practically falling off the wings, it was a good one. We had good luck on this one. We were high enough to have a good long glide, and this field was as good a landing spot as any. We could have been swimming. Fruit salad? Miss E continued to pull out a limitless variety of food from the basket. How she had fit it all into the small space was a mystery, and I began to wonder if the extra weight in the picnic was to blame for our untimely and unplanned landing. So, tell me about your mother. The sudden shift in conversation erased all thought of airplane engines and picnic baskets from my mind. I stumbled through a few words about her playing bridge with the neighbors and some of her favorite meals to cook before a look from Miss E told me that this was not what she was asking about. Come on, Bets. People spend so much time wondering about me when I come to town, they don't realize how much listening and watching can be done when a body's not talking all the time. There's no limit to the gossip I overhear when I'm out and about, or the things I happen to notice that no one else does because they're all too busy looking at me. And even if I didn't, I'd have to wonder why a girl whose father's been away for months is sitting around with me instead of keeping her mother company and helping out around the house. Between school, grocery deliveries, research in the library, and taking up space in my kitchen table, you're spending a considerable amount of time avoiding home. So fess up, Bets. I started to say something, but then didn't because I didn't really know what to say. I sighed. I shrugged my shoulders. I threw up my hands and rolled my eyes as if to say there was nothing to talk about. But I didn't actually say it because I knew there was something to talk about. I looked down at the blanket in front of me and pulled off little pieces of lint, hoping Miss E would eventually give up and say something so I didn't have to. But she simply sat in front of me, occasionally taking a bite of food off her plate. I checked occasionally, trying to lift my eyes as far as they would go without raising my head. I finally let loose with a frustrated growl and a string of run-on sentences. What do you want me to say? Do you want to hear about how emotionless my mother is? How there are no good days or bad days with her? Just bridge games and crock-pot suppers? And look how white the laundry came out this week. I could talk about the same 3 or 4 questions she asks me at the dinner table every night to make it seem like we're actually having a normal conversation. But even worse than that is the time when she doesn't talk, not really talk anyway, like a trip to the grocery store, not Johnson's, but all the way to Santa Rosa, the whole drive without a word. And then nothing but get a can of this or a box of that, and then nothing the whole ride home until I'm ready to explode because I can't possibly believe that someone could go that long without talking. No talking at all. Like she's not interested in what I have to say or what's going on in my life, or even just to tell me something interesting that happened to her. But that's the easy stuff. That's the stuff I'm sure every kid deals with. The parents that don't know how to talk to them, I'm lucky. I just have one, right? But the part that really has me walking around the house like there's a piano hanging over my head ready to fall is talking about my father, because that never happens. But every second that I'm home, I think it must be about to happen. Surely today she'll say something, maybe after dinner, maybe before bed, maybe in an hour or a minute or a second or 2. But she never does. She reads his letters, but that's not talking. Not a sit down, hey, how are you doing? Yes, I miss him too. I miss my dad. I miss him. And I'm afraid of what could happen to him. And there's one other person in the world who should miss him and worry about him as much as me. But she doesn't say anything, ever. Then I cried. A good old pull my knees to my chin, bury my face in my hands, cry. I figured any second Miss E would put her hand on my shoulder, and I was ready to shrug it off. It didn't come, and I was relieved, but at the same time, I was hurt that she wasn't coming over to comfort me. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I dragged out my cry for an extra minute or so, giving her time to put her arm around me and say, there, it'll be okay. But she didn't. When I lifted my head and wiped the tears off my cheeks with the palms of my hands, I was surprised to see Miss E still picking at the remains of our picnic, gazing at the sky and looking like her thoughts were far away. I was about to say something when she sprang to her feet faster than I would have thought she could. Well, I suppose I should take a look at that engine and figure out if we'll be flying home or hitchhiking. Judging from the traffic that's been by, it could be a long walk. She ducked under a wing and disappeared toward the front of the plane, leaving me red-eyed and wet-cheeked and feeling like I just poured my heart out to the cornstalks surrounding me. Fresh tears came at the feeling of betrayal I had from being pushed into talking and then promptly ignored. But I choked them back and stormed off after Miss E. I found her standing on a small step built into the side of the plane with the engine cover open. She was peering in and didn't look up when I approached. I can't believe you listened to me say all that, and then I spouted before I was cut off. Ah, Bets, glad you came up here. Be a dear and dig under my seat for the toolbox. I'm pretty sure Fred keeps one there in case of emergency. Not that our little adventure constitutes one, but having a few tools on hand would certainly make this little fix-up job go faster. I bit my tongue, grumbling the rest of what I wanted to say, and climbed up on the wing in search of the toolbox. Fuel pump stopped, Missy said when I returned with the small metal box. I couldn't imagine there was anything in it that could fix an airplane. But I handed the box up to her anyway. I crossed my arms, waiting for some response from Miss E, and when none came, I turned away, ready to stomp down the farm road in whatever direction would take me toward home. But a call of, I could use a hand up here, from Miss E stopped me in my tracks. I struggled to get my foot up on the small step on the side of the duster and wondered how the 70-year-old woman above me had done it. She reached down to pull me up, but I hesitated to take her hand, thinking I might pull her down on top of me. Missy sighed and grabbed my wrist, giving me enough lift to reach the step and clamber up to the engine. Come on, Bets. We're not climbing Mount Everest here. The greasy parts of the engine I saw sticking out from the duster before we took off were a pretty good indication of what was under the engine cover. Any parts not covered in grease were coated with a thick layer of rust. I secretly crossed my fingers with the hope that Miss E wouldn't be able to get it started again, and decided that the long walk down the farm road would be the best option. Balancing on the small step next to Miss E, I could understand why she needed some help. The curve of the plane made it difficult to stand on the step without holding on with one hand, so she was forced to work with one hand, grabbing tools and reaching down into the engine while she held onto the edge of the engine compartment with the other. When she said she needed a hand, she meant it. With me handing her tools and taking engine parts from her, the job was much easier. She talked while she worked and told me what she was doing and what she thought the problem was. Since the engine had just stopped running without any signs of smoke or unusual noises, Miss E suspected the fuel pump. It would be an easy fix, she thought, but getting to it meant taking off several parts. She told me what each part was as she handed it to me and explained what it did. I set each carefully on the cradle formed where the engine cover met the windshield and hoped I'd be able to remember which was which when she asked for them again. The fuel pump finally reached. Miss E discovered a broken wire and was able to strip the rubber insulation off back to a stronger section of wire and reconnect it to the pump. Reassembly of the engine went quickly, and I was ready to hop off the step to the ground when Miss E put her hand on top of mine and held it there against the edge of the engine compartment. She looked me in the eye with a stare that made me want to turn away to the ground or the sky or anywhere else, but I couldn't. I'm not one to tell folks what to do, Bets. I always went my own way and followed my own ideas. I don't want anyone telling me what to do now. Didn't want it when I was your age. So I won't tell you how to act or think towards your mother. And I never had kids of my own, so I can't say much about parenting. But I think I have a pretty good idea of where your mother is coming from. I wasn't much older than you when World War I hit, and I saw my fair share of kids' fathers go away and not come back. And then I lost Sam in World War II. After that, they stopped numbering the wars, so I suppose that means they're getting smaller, but it doesn't seem like that's so. And they sure do seem to involve the whole world, even if they don't call them that. She looked up at the sky, tracing the path of a cloud, and paused long enough that I thought she was done talking. Then her eyes returned to mine. My point is that I think your mother and I might see eye to eye when it comes to dealing with a war and someone you love. With that, she hopped down. I turned to follow, but she was standing right where I would land, so I was forced to stay on the step and look down at her while she looked back up at me with her hands on her hips. Might be your mom's way of dealing with your father being away is to get quiet about it and keep things inside. And that might not fit what you need from her or how you expect her to be, but that's just too bad for you. Close and latch that engine cover before you come down, okay, Bets? I stood balanced on the step, with her last thought stuck in my head. I expected Miss E to take my side. After all, I was the one with the mother that wouldn't acknowledge that my father was away fighting a war, but my tearful outpouring on the picnic blanket seemed like it had happened to someone else. According to Miss E, I was the problem, and it was my mother who had all the troubles. I turned all this over in my head as I struggled to close the engine compartment without slamming my fingers in it. Finally closed and latched, I jumped down to the ground, feeling more confused than I had before I stepped up. Our exit from the cornfield was almost as exciting as our entry. Miss E called me back toward the tail, and together we lifted it off the ground. I suppose an airplane needs to be light in order to fly through the air, but because I knew I'd be climbing into it and trusting my life to it, I wanted it to be heavier, more substantial, with its tail no longer dragging and its big wheels rolling easily along the furrows. Miss E and I had enough pull to get the duster fully out onto the farm road and pointing down its length. Fuel pump fixed, at least for the moment, the engine roared to life and we careened down the road. The lower wings of the duster chopped off the corn stalks as we went. I gripped the edge of the cockpit again, waiting for the bump of the wheels on the dirt road to turn into the smooth glide of wings in the air. And thought about what Miss E had said. Did I really have any expectations from my mother? She had always been the way she was, I thought. She had always been flat, emotionalist. She'd always just moved on with the business of the day-to-day without reaction. It had been my father who reacted, a big grin, a laugh, or a tearful eye and a hug when I needed it. I realized as the duster cleared the cornfield and soared once again into the sky that what I was really looking for wasn't a change in my mother. What I really needed and wanted was to have my father home again. The stick between my knees pushed forward under Miss E's control, and the plane stopped its climb and leveled off. I watched the throttle knob push in slightly, and the roar of the engine quieted to a steady hum. I felt almost sleepy as the afternoon sun and the vibrations lulled me, so much so that I jumped a little when Miss E's voice shouted over the noise of the plane and the air rushing past. One thing you got to remember, Bats, is that your mother is missing your father even more than you are, even if she doesn't show it. A daughter and a father, well, that's something special, but you don't know what it's like to be a wife yet, to love a husband. Miss E had all the time she needed to continue talking to me in a quiet cornfield, but she'd clammed up and set to work getting the plane in the air again, one behind the other, with engine noise filling the air as it rushed past us. She started up chatting again, but like everything she did, There was a reason behind it. There was time to think as we got the duster pointed in the right direction, as the horizon slipped below us, and the landscape spread out around us. Maybe she needed time to think about what to say next, but more likely, she knew I needed time to consider what she told me while fixing the engine. She waited until I'd realized something, and then she gave me a little bit more to think about. My reply was on my lips, my defense, my reasons for why I knew that I loved my father more than my mother did. But the throttle knob moved again, and the engine noise increased in pitch and volume. Miss E had let me know that this was a one-way conversation, her talking, me thinking. Our landing at the airstrip was uneventful. As we walked back to the red pickup, Fred Noonan's figure was silhouetted in the opening of a hangar. Miss E raised a hand, and he waved back in reply. There was no mention of the problem with the fuel pump or our emergency cornfield landing. I expected the drive home to bring another installment in our conversation about my mother, but Missy only asked a few questions about school and told little stories about some of the places we drove by. She had clearly said all there was to say on the topic. As far as changing my perspective, the rest was up to me. All right. So next chapter is another chapter I struggled a little bit when I was writing. The next chapter is called 20 Words. And in this chapter, you'll remember that part of the assignment from Mr. Flynn is not just to identify the people in his 100 pictures, but to write about them in 20 words or less. And that's the sort of assignment that might seem easy because you only have to write 20 words. But when you're writing about someone as amazing as Amelia Earhart, how do you sum that up in 20 words? So I knew that I had to give Betts these 20 words, that she had to write these 20 words because they have to in order to win the competition. But I really could not figure out what those 20 words were going to be. And I wanted them to have some significance, and I wanted them to be meaningful enough and end up prompting some kind of response from Miss E as well. But again, I really had no idea what those 20 words were going to be. And I actually, in an early draft of the book, I didn't even include the words because I just felt like, well, I'm going to move on with writing the story, and then I know I'm going to have to come back to those 20 words. And what I ended up with is something that is, I think, kind of like a poem that has sort of a double meaning. And I think in a lot of poetry, we see a very simple image presented or a very simple story presented. And then if you read a little deeper, you find that there's a lot more to the poem. And I had Betts use something called enjambment, which is a technique in poetry where the thought, a thought is broken up between lines. And if you read the first half of the thought, if you just read the first line, it seems like it's saying something else. And when you get to the second half of the thought, when you get to the following line, you realize it's really says something different. And there's a poem that uses this technique. It's called "We Are Seven," and it's by William Wordsworth. And I actually, the link to that poem is in this video, so you can check that out. But it's a great. There's some great examples of enjambment in that, where you read the first line and you think, is he really saying that? And then you get to the second line and you realize he's saying something else. So I tried to use that to kind of let Betts say what she really knows about Amelia Earhart, while also kind of saying what everyone else thought about Amelia Earhart. And I will, unfortunately, that's probably not going to come through in a read aloud. I will try to kind of break things up line by line in how I read it, but I will also I will put it in text form and link to it in the video description as well, so you can take a look at what it actually looks like on the page. All right, so this chapter is called 20 Words. If Miss E meant for the flight in the duster to change me in some way, it didn't work. Like going back to school after discovering that Miss E was really Amelia Earhart, I expected a change. I thought things would somehow be noticeably different. But the days after our flight were like any others. Life with my mother was unchanged, and that was the whole point of Miss E taking me flying, a different perspective, she said. Well, other than half scaring the pants off me, the flight hadn't done anything to change my feelings toward my mother. And Missy's little pep talk with me in the cornfield hadn't made me more understanding toward my mother's lack of emotion. I gave it an honest try. I brought up my father a couple times at the dinner table when I normally would have remained silent. My mother seemed a little surprised, but she dodged the topic as skillfully as ever. I asked a couple questions after she'd read a letter from him one night, hoping to start a conversation, but she only smiled and sighed and folded up the letter. After a week of trying, I let myself slip back into my old routine of keeping to myself and nodding politely when my mother talked about the weather or the neighbors. School wasn't any different either. Other than my feeling like telling everyone I saw in the hallways that I'd gone flying with Amelia Earhart, heck, I would have been happy just to tell Anne and Cassie or Susan that I'd been flying at all. As far as weekend activities went, I figured I could top anyone's story about softball wins, first dates, or even first kisses. But, of course, I couldn't tell anyone anything. Our tally in Mr. Flynn's class was inching higher. I hadn't given away Amelia Earhart's identity yet, but it was looking like I would need to soon if we were going to win the trip to San Francisco. We'd been using what I discovered in the library that day, what the class had come to call Flynn's rules, even though we'd never talked to Mr. Flynn about them. Here's the list of Flynn's rules. Number 1, look for connections with other famous Americans. This category was ripe with results. We'd found 4 first ladies who were definitely more deserving of a place on Mr. Flynn's wall than their husbands were. Number 2, come up with a list of likely suspects. We came up with a list of our top 100 Americans and then went through the list, crossing names off once we double-checked their photos and compared it to what we could find in the library. Mr. Flynn had slipped in 5 that had made our list as well, but we'd missed them on our first run through the library because of rule number 3. Number 3, look beyond the iconic photos. Theodore Roosevelt, before his funny glasses and mustache? Marilyn Monroe, when she was still Norma Jean? Yep, those and others had been staring down at us from Mr. Flynn's walls all year. We were down to 3. I knew I'd be giving up Amelia Earhart soon. I wouldn't be telling anyone about Miss E, of course, even though it felt like the only thing happening in the world other than Mr. Flynn's students. Even though it felt like the only thing happening in the world other than Mr. Flynn's students, most people in Forestville had no idea about the pictures on our classroom wall, and if they did, they didn't care. So there wasn't much chance that me revealing the identity of the smiling, messy-haired woman on the wall would cause someone in town to guess that the little old lady who lived 5 miles outside of town was Amelia Earhart. But I was still nervous about it. I had to get her 20 words right. It didn't matter that no one outside my class would even know what I wrote, and most of them wouldn't even bother to read it. They'd be so distracted by winning the trip. I'd known, I'd known what I wrote. I'd know what I wrote. And unlike all the other photos in the classroom, I knew the woman I'd be writing about. I'd sat at her kitchen table. I'd sat in her airplane. I had to get her words right. I started working on it when we had 5 pictures left, mulling ideas over in my mind when I should have been paying attention in class. Mr. Flynn caught me once scribbling phrases in the margins of my notebook. He didn't say anything, just raised an eyebrow and walked up the aisle. Something bothering you, Bets? Miss E asked one afternoon while we sat at her table. I hesitated, not really knowing if something was bothering me, not really sure where my thoughts had been. She'd thankfully not brought up my mother since our flight weeks ago, but I realized, while figuring out what to say in response to her question, that I had been thinking about the words I'd need to write. I'd been so focused, I was scowling. I told her. I knew trying to hide the truth wasn't an option with Miss E. Part of me hoped that she might offer to help, might even insist on helping to make sure I got it right. That part of me was wrong. Miss E just nodded and was silent, a long silence, but I knew her well enough now to know the conversation wasn't over. I wondered if she knew that I knew about the trick she'd played with those long silences, and I wondered if she was making them longer on purpose, giving me more time to think, or doing it simply to annoy me because I was on to her. Well, Bets, she said at last, you'll get it right. Come show me when you do. I had long ago figured out that Miss E's way of helping someone was to give them absolutely no help at all. So it didn't surprise me that she didn't offer to sit down with me that afternoon and co-write her 20 words. What caught me off guard was the notion that Miss E would be seeing what I wrote about her. I knew I had to get those words right. For myself, I wanted them right. For my classmates who would be reading them, and for Mr. Flynn. It never occurred to me that I would be writing them for Miss E's eyes. I left her kitchen feeling worse than I'd entered, but there was no taking it back. Miss E knew about the assignment now. She'd be expecting to see the words I wrote about her. Woody Guthrie fell prey a few days later, and Marian Anderson bit the dust right after him. Amelia was one of only 2 photographs left. When Sammy Wilkes turned in his 20 words on George Washington Carver, I was determined not to leave school until I finished writing mine. I asked Mr. Flynn if I could come to his room after school. I'd never really stayed after school before, other than going to the library, but that didn't count. There were kids who stayed for sports or play practice, and the student council kids who always seemed to be decorating the gym for a dance. There were kids who'd gotten in trouble or hadn't turned in an assignment, and the kids who were struggling and stayed after for extra help from a teacher. I didn't fit into any of those groups, which was probably why Mr. Flynn's eyebrows shot up when I asked him, the same way he'd done when he caught me editing Amelia's words during class, but he agreed to see me at the end of the day. He was working when I came in, grading papers probably. If Mr. Flynn was curious at all about why I wanted to work in his classroom after school, he didn't show it. He lifted his head when I came in, gave me a smile, but then quickly went back to work with whatever was on his desk. When I'd asked him if I could stay, I didn't really know why I thought it would be easier to work in Mr. Flynn's room. It just seemed right. But once I'd lifted my head to take a short break from writing, I'd realized I'd made the right choice. There, in front of me, was Amelia, curly-haired and smiling. I couldn't have asked for better inspiration. I don't know how long I worked. It was long enough that Mr. Flynn had finished whatever work he'd had on his desk, but he was respectful enough of my need that he busied himself with other things. I only caught him checking the clock once. I let my thoughts wander enough to wonder what Mr. Flynn's life was like outside of his classroom. He didn't wear a ring, so I knew there wasn't a wife waiting for him at home, but a girlfriend? This had been lunchtime conversation more than once. Most of the girls had decided that Mr. Flynn was handsome enough that there must be a girlfriend. The only question was whether they talked about anything other than U.S. history when they went out on dates. But that could be left to lunchtime. I had work to do. As I scribbled and crossed out, I kept thinking about the quick facts section of the elementary school Amelia Earhart book I'd found in the library, and how the author had chosen the word disappear. Maybe it was just the word that had made the most sense, but it seemed to me a careful choice. Like it was a word that said what had happened, but at the same time left the reader wondering what really had happened. It was a word that just took up space on it. It was a word that just took up space on the page, one that your eye could skim over so that you could move along to the next one, except that it nagged a little, causing you to jump back, reread, and think about what it really meant. Those were the sorts of words I was looking for. I had a lot to say in those 20 words. Finishing up Mr. Flynn's challenge and getting to San Francisco was starting to feel secondary to what I really needed to accomplish. I had to recognize all that Amelia had done and how influential she was. But if that's all I did, my 20 words would have been no better than the quick facts section in the in the Earhart book for kids. I knew the rest of the story, or at least the rest of the story so far. Who else knew that? I couldn't resist weaving that in, finding a way to not tell the secret, but tell it at the same time. And then there was the Electra sitting in that barn, touched only by stray sunbeams filtering through the hay dust. Miss E had to fly that plane again, had to finish what she started. I think maybe the idea entered my mind the day I talked to Miss E about the 20 words, and she told me to show them to her when I'd finished. Maybe I didn't realize it, or maybe I didn't want to admit it, but what I really hoped, was that I could write something that would convince Miss E to fly again. But 20 words was not a lot of words. I stared at the paper that was currently on my desk, the only one that hadn't been crumpled and discarded. There were about 20 words on it, but they did nothing but complete Mr. Flynn's assignment. In frustration, I tore the paper in half and brushed the halves off my desk in different directions. The left half somersaulted to the floor and landed face up, where it could taunt me with its half sentences. I bent to grab it and crumple it into a ball too, but I stopped before I did and read what was there. And what was there reminded me of some of the poems we'd read in English class the month before. Short little poems with no rhymes that had kids immediately raising their hands to debate whether they were really poems at all. They said a lot with just a few words on each line, with thoughts that seemed to carry over from one line to the next. Sometimes an idea got broken up between lines where you'd think the writing was saying one thing, but then you'd finish the next line and realize the writer really meant something else. And sometimes you'd have to read the poem over and over again before you realized what it was saying. That was exactly what I needed to do. I looked at my half sheet of paper and pulled a fresh one from my binder. And then I started writing again, taking my words from the torn sheet and using them again, but breaking up the sentences, no longer striving for the perfect paragraph. Instead, thinking in lines, not worrying if a thought got broken up between two lines. Instead, trying to do it on purpose. After some furious scribbling, crossing out, and more scribbling, I finally put my pen down with a definitive smack on my desk and read what I had. Amelia Earhart. When Amelia Earhart circled the world, she captivated us. She lives in her accomplishments. I found her an inspiration. Fly! Exclamation point. Again, I will put the text of that in a format where you can see the line breaks. It wasn't going to win any poetry awards, but I wasn't trying for an award. I didn't say anything. I just walked my paper up to the front of the room and put it on Mr. Flynn's now empty desk. He only read the name at the top of the page before he started nodding, and his eyes flicked up to mine to let me know I had the right person, something I'd known for months. But when he continued reading, his expression changed. I could see his eyes move up the page to reread lines again. He let out a quiet, huh, which was part question, but mostly statement. He lifted his eyes up again to make contact with mine, and I felt like he was scanning my face, looking for an expression that would give away what my words were hiding. When he didn't find it, he put my paper down on his desk, and his hand went to his chin to scratch his thin beard as his eyes tracked back and forth, rereading what I'd written one more time. This is some interesting writing, Elizabeth. He paused, and I had no idea what was coming next. I have 99 other papers from your classmates about the people on the walls, some of them clearly struggling to keep under the 20-word limit. Others, I think, happy that that's all they had to write. But all of them are as factual and as boring as an encyclopedia. Your writing really says a lot, and it says it in a way that makes the reader think. Nicely done. Congratulations, Elizabeth. It looks like your class is going to San Francisco. All right, that is our reading for today. Thank you for tuning in to Mondays with Miss E, and I will see you next week.